So this, of course, leads to my talk today. I think it's a great topic because from the very outset, it's something I think that has wide interest to most Canadians. I think most of us, we're preaching to the choir today, but I think most Canadians will at least heard of the Victoria Cross. And it really has obviously strong historical implications as well as modern ones. So we're going to talk about that today. Right, so before I get going here, I just wanted to give you a quick, brief little outline here so you can sort of follow along where I'm going. We'll be talking for about 30 minutes or so. And I'm going to begin just with a brief history of the award itself, how it came to be awarded to Commonwealth troops. And then the big point after that would be the so-called mythologizing of Victoria Cross, which really has strong modern implications. And within that, I'm going to share a number of citations which sort of bleed into this idea of mythologizing the Victoria Cross, hardening the standard, which has all contributed to the state we're in since World War II, which really is a tough one because we have not awarded a Victoria Cross since that time. So all of this is relevant. And at the end, I'm going to express some of the modern challenges which have led to this problem, that is, no VCs having been awarded since that time, and I'll offer some possible solutions to those challenges. So I'm happy to welcome any questions at the end of the session. Matt Barrett and I will be sharing the panel, so please hold your questions till that time. Right, so measuring only 38 millimeters across, the Victoria Cross with its iconic crimson ribbon, crowned lion detail, and the simple inscription "For Valor" on its obverse is the highest award for military gallantry in Britain and in the Commonwealth. It's perhaps the most difficult medal in the entire world to earn, and the VC is currently awarded for, quote, "the most conspicuous bravery, a daring or preeminent act of valor or self-sacrifice, or extreme devotion to duty in the presence of the enemy." So the VC itself was introduced into the British honor system on the 29th of January, 1856, as the highest award for gallantry. And on the 1st of January, 1867, which obviously was an auspicious year for Canada, the eligibility of the award was extended to members of colonial militias serving alongside British troops. So for the actions between 1854 and 1898, 5 Canadian-born servicemen in British units won the Victoria Cross, including in the Crimean War, the Indian Mutiny of 1857, the Andaman Islands Expedition, and the Battle of Omdurman during the Sudan campaign. It was not until the 5th of July, 1900, however, that the first Canadian serving in a Canadian unit would earn a Victoria Cross. This, of course, was Sergeant Arthur Richardson of Lord Strathcona's Horse, seen here with the glorious Stetson cap and the Victoria Cross pinned to his chest so proudly. So for his part, Richardson rode his wounded horse toward and across enemy fire to retrieve an injured serviceman and then proceeded to bring him back to safety. Richardson was one of 5 Canadians to receive the Victoria Cross for actions during the Boer War. So from the introduction of the VC in 1856 and right up until the First World War, many different authorities actually questioned whether or not the award was becoming too common. So at least 522 Victoria Crosses were actually awarded prior to World War I. The awarding of 11 Victoria Crosses for the 2-day Battle of Rorke's Drift, for instance, during the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879, drew some protest, and Queen Victoria herself suggested that the award might become too common. During the Boer War, Lord Kitchener remarked the VC recommendation should be discouraged in cases of pulling the wounded or dismounted to safety, which was very similar to Richardson's brave action. So this pervasive attitude that the VC was at risk of becoming too common strengthened the award standards from the First World War onwards, and that will lead us on to this. So by the start of the First World War, the process of awarding the Victoria Cross generally began with a recommendation from the individual's immediate commanding officer, and the action required a minimum of 3 witnesses to ultimately support the recommendation, which may or may not be approved. Once the VC had been recommended, the recommendation moved through the military chain of command, and at any level, it could be halted, downgraded, or upgraded. Finally, the VC was required to be approved by VC committees within the War Office, the Air Ministry, or the Admiralty, and finally by King George V himself. It's quite a rigorous process. There were several exceptions to the rule of 3 witnesses, however, that I'll note. Probably most famously was Billy Bishop's award on the German Aerodrome of 1917. He won this award without a single witness to his action, which remains controversial. So approximately 75%, you can believe it, of Canada's total Victoria Crosses were awarded during the 4-year period of 1915 to 1918. And this incredible imbalance requires some explanation. Even within the span of the First World War, the number of Victoria Crosses awarded to Canadians is heavily slanted to 1917 and 1918. So in 1915, there were about 7 Canadians who won the VC. In 1916, there were 5. And then in 1917, you see this huge increase where 24 Canadians won the VC. And finally, in 1918, 37 Canadians won the Victoria Cross. So during the First World War, men were required to perform otherworldly acts of heroism to win their VC. If they did not die in the remarkable action earning them the award, then it was seemingly improbable that they had survived. Standing as a sobering testament to the difficulty of winning a Victoria Cross in the First World War, over 40% of those Canadian VCs and 25% of the 628 total VCs of the war were awarded posthumously. The number of VCs won by Canadians in 1915 and 1918, however, are significantly disproportionate to the numbers awarded before or since. It was the high standards established in the First World War that future generations and future conflicts would be compared to, and this legendary standard has served to elevate and even mythologize the Victoria Cross. The portrait here, by the way, is of Lieutenant Colonel Thane McDowell, who was actually one of 4 Canadians to win the Victoria Cross at Vimy Ridge, and he was the only one of those 4 to survive the war. This original portrait, which is unique, his posture, I've always found it quite evocative, and the Victoria Cross itself is actually on display in Soldiers Tower at the University of Toronto. So within the context of World War I, and countless acts of valiance beyond measure, we begin to see this resulting toughening of the VC standard. So Sergeant Will Bird, and I pulled out a quote from him that sort of summarizes the situation so well, about the difficulties even then of earning a Victoria Cross. Will Bird himself, of course, was a First World War veteran, a member of the 42nd Battalion, and he was also an author of the incredible memoir, And We Go On. You may know it by the later title, Ghosts Have Warm Hands, which was a publication in the 1960s. But if you ever get your hands on the original, that really is the best and most visceral explanation, I think, by a Canadian and his experiences in World War I. So the full quote I have here. And every man who fought at the front knew that for every high honor awarded, hundreds were deserved, and those given were the lucky ones seen by authority. Valiant men in desperate situations and battles performed prodigious feats of valor and endurance, were killed and forgotten, others survived. With only a few comrades knowing just what they had accomplished, few men gained Victoria Crosses without exhibiting extraordinary courage, but their equals fought unadorned in every company on the Western Front. Great quote. So Berg raises a common issue which greatly inhibited the recommendation and subsequent approval of Victoria Crosses, which is surviving witnesses. So the requirement of these 3 witnesses corroborating potential VC action was too often impractical or impossible to achieve, particularly in those early years of the war. CEF, inexperienced, had this profound learning curve, big casualties at Mount Sorel and St. Eloi. Those guys didn't receive any VCs. I think that was the nature of unsuccessful campaigns versus the successful ones. And these early haphazard, and ill-devised attacks of the early war often gutted units, and these attacks were ultimately unlikely to produce the requisite witnesses for VC recommendation. So as many Victoria Crosses as there are from World War I, certainly there could have been many more that we'll never know about. So the changes to tactics, education, especially in the experience of the CEF, generally resulted in more success on the battlefield, and a higher number of VCs awarded to Canadians resulted in the latter 2 years of the war. So at the Battle of the Somme, fought over 90 days in the summer of 1916, for instance, the Canadian Corps suffered 24,000 casualties, but only 3 Canadians won the VC, 2 of them posthumous. Compared to the Somme, in the 4-day Battle of Vimy Ridge, as I mentioned, 4 won the Victoria Cross and 5 for the Battle of Arras overall. So Canada's role in 1918 offers an even more astonishing case study. So the 37 Victoria Crosses won by Canadians in 1918 is more than double the number of VCs won by Canadians in the last 100 years. A resounding 29 of these 37 were actually won in the last 96 days of the war, or the 100 Days Offensive. Obviously, Canada served as the spearhead of the British Empire in the last 100 days. We defeated 1/4 of the German army. We fired the final shots of the war and suffered 45,000 casualties. It's all been well documented. So what does this all mean for the high propensity of VCs in that year? As I think 1918 saw the Canadian Corps at its best. The Corps was prominent in a costly role in the forefront of winning the war, contributed to the much higher number of VCs awarded in this time. So to better illustrate some of this before I move on, I just wanted to highlight a few of these VCs just to help understand what it took to win an award of this nature at that time. So of course the painting here, which I'm sure you've all seen, by war artist Alfred Munnings, depicts Lieutenant Flowerdeau's grand charge on the 30th of March 1918 at Moriel Wood. This, of course, is largely recognized as the last successful cavalry charge in history, and it was a surprise to the German defenders. So you see Flowerdeau at the front there. They have their sabers drawn. It's a great effort, something more reminiscent of the Crimean War. And they passed over the German lines headlong into machine gun fire. They essentially halted the German advance in that sector. And that really was the high watermark of the Germans in the First World War during their spring offensive. So it's this great moment in history. Flowerdeau, of course, is shot multiple times. He's unhorsed. He still has the cognizance to cheer his men on as loudly as he can. His award, of course, was posthumous, but these are the sort of levels that we're talking about that requires the recommendation. So 2 more I'll highlight because they actually have connections to the RCMI here, so I couldn't pass on without mentioning the 2 of them. So the first you see here on the left is the portrait of Captain William Barker. The portrait is over there on the wall. It's actually a very fine reproduction from the original in the War Museum. So Barker was actually the most decorated serviceman in the history of the Commonwealth. That's not just Canada, but the entire British Empire. So when he won his Victoria Cross in October of 1918, he was flying over the Mormont Forest in France. He had shot down a German scout plane, and he had found himself then surrounded by 15 German fighters who had broke off from a larger group of about 60 aircraft. So all these German fighters are fighting on Barker. He actually has the wherewithal to avoid them, knock down 3 of them. He's shot multiple times. A lot of blood loss in the cockpit. He actually faints twice midair before crash landing his aircraft in Allied lines. They rush him to a hospital, and he does survive from his wounds, but he's never the same. It's interesting to note as well in his portrait, which was done after the war, he still has that swing from the broken bones that he suffered in that crash landing. Miracle that he survived, let alone knock down other aircraft. And of course, won the Victoria Cross for this action. The second individual beside Barker there is Captain Smith Rutherford. And Rutherford, another extraordinary case in 1918, by himself, armed only with a 1911 Colt pistol. Which I actually have in the RCMI collection. So it's a very fine piece. So this Colt was actually used in Captain Rutherford's action in the Battle of Scarpe in August 26th, 1918. Wonderful piece. And Rutherford, by himself, armed with just that Colt, had 45 German defenders, armed defenders, surrendered to him. And later that same day, on the 26th of August, he attacked a German pillbox with a Lewis gun section and had 35 more Germans surrender to him personally. So quite a day, quite an effort. Again, miraculous. Any of these cases that you read, you're always wondering, how did this individual survive, let alone accomplish these actions? So these are the levels that we're talking about, and this really serves this tightening, this hardening of the VC standard that we're going to get into here. So this Great War generation, like Rutherford, like Barker, like Flowerdew, which defeated Prussian militarism, won the war, and endured the slog and the privation of France and Flanders, has been roundly lionized and commemorated in Canada. The Great War for this nation was the single most important event in its history to that point. The whole birth of a nation rhetoric aside, Canada was then a small dominion beset with tremendous grief and a desperate search for meaning within the context of 66,000 war dead and 240,000 casualties overall. The men who served and died in that conflict were memorialized coast to coast by every size community in stone epitaphs, statues, artwork, place names, plaques, public spaces, and even in the construction of the Peace Tower and the Books of Remembrance and the new Canadian Parliament, which was constructed just after the First World War. Like their sacrifice, so too were their actions mythologized. So by the Second World War, the actions of the British and Commonwealth servicemen were not only held to this tremendously high standard, which was established by those in the Great War, but they were also compared to this memory, to this mythology. The Victoria Cross was effectively placed on a grand pedestal and became increasingly difficult to win a recommendation. Moreover, the Canadian and the British Empire losses in the First World War were far greater than those in the Second or in any ensuing conflict combined. So British and Commonwealth war dead totaled at least 1.1 million in the First World War and 580,000 in the Second. So with this high propensity to an award in VC posthumously, the much higher number of war dead in World War I favored the higher rate of successful VC recommendations. In this context, the standard for winning a VC in the Second World War compared to the First were far more difficult. Only 182 VCs were awarded overall, and 16 to Canadians. Indeed, throughout the Second World War, dozens of VC recommendations were downgraded or denied, including at least 8 members of the RCAF, and a VC action entailed an 85% probability or worse that the person involved would not survive. Official policy of the again to reflect the increasing difficulty of winning the VC in the Second World War. In July 1944, for instance, the 8th Army Headquarters wrote to component formations, "Unless the action has some bearing on the immediate success of the operation, recommendations cannot be accepted for immediate awards." One of these 16 Canadian Victoria Crosses, of course, is right here at the RCMI, and it is an excellent example. So I had to feature it at least a little bit. So the winner, Major Fred Tilston, was actually a Toronto native. He was a longtime loyal member of the RCMI. He served in the Essex Scottish Regiment, and he earned his Victoria Cross on the 1st of March 1945 near Udem, Germany. In the action, he actually lost both legs and one of his eyes. It's quite a remarkable award. We have it on display in the medals room in the second floor, but because of various reasons, the original is stored off-site. So this photograph, and I'll give you a closer image, courtesy of my assistant curator, Jeremy Hood. You can see some of the great detail there of an original Victoria Cross, one of only 16 in Canada. It's a truly beautiful piece. And I wanted to say this too, as a curator, the importance of these medals to the material history of Canada. They're really pieces of national interest. And they're so important, so indelible, that we're very fortunate to have an original here at the RCMI. Here's a rare shot of the obverse of the award. You can see the date stenciled in from Tilston's action, the 1st of March, 1945. And some of the glaze as well peeling, which is an unavoidable result of time. Great artifact. I'll show these two because I found them quite interesting, and we compiled these over my research. So this little pie chart here actually shows the percentages of the Victoria Crosses which were won, from the 1850s all the way to 1945. You can see obviously the lion's share won in the First World War, and it gets smaller and smaller over time. One quick note as well, you may have seen various numbers quoted for how many Canadians have won Victoria Crosses. I've seen as low as 94 or as high as 99. This is a result in the challenge of strictly identifying someone as Canadian. So a lot of these guys were British born. They may have immigrated and settled in Canada after the war. One was a Newfoundlander who, of course, they didn't enter the Canadian Confederation until 1949. So I've used the full 99 for this graph, as well as this one, which I'll just say a quick word as well, which I found quite interesting. Thanks to Harrison Kennedy for helping me compile this data because it's not otherwise available. And these are the location of all of our Victoria Crosses. Again, the largest percentage are held at the War Museum. You may have heard recently in the news they actually just acquired 3 more, which doesn't happen very often. So we included those in the percentage. And the nice thing, I guess, about 99, it's close to 100. So it's more or less the percentages are the actual number of VCs where you see them across Canada. A number of them, 6 in fact, are lost or unknown, so maybe a private collector is still with the family, and a couple of them, including one we used to hold, have been stolen over time. So it has quite a history in itself, but I suppose we're comforted by the fact that almost half of them are in the national collection. So I'm going to move on here just to explain the next 10 minutes before I end sort of the modern implications to everything I just described, the possible standards, the feats of heroism that these new servicemen are compared. So in 1967, during our centennial here, we actually abandoned the British awards and honor system in favor of our own. So at that time, we actually eliminated the Victoria Cross from our awards and honors. And it actually wasn't restored until the 1990s when the Mulroney government put forth a motion to reinstate the award. So in 1993, they brought the Canadian Victoria Cross back. It's more or less the exact same in composition. You can see it here. The only major difference is instead of for valor, it says pro valor, which they use Latin to sort of satisfy the bilingual complications in this country. So it's an interesting award, but it's been an award in name only. And that's what we're going to get into here. So the difficulty in winning this award since the Second World War has also been compounded by the changes to the modern battlefield and Canada's role in it. Simply put, the opportunities to win Victoria Crosses on the battlefield have diminished over time. The age of charging on horseback headlong into machine gun fire or single-handedly firing down 50 Germans with a Lewis gun on the hip or engaging in a dogfight with 15 German aircraft, that's not happening anymore. So in the past century, warfare has completely changed, but the standards for the VC have not adapted to these changes. Today, any witness can nominate a VC candidate, but it must be endorsed by the nominee's unit commander and is subject to reviews and revisions before a final decision can be made by the Chancellery of Honours on behalf of the Governor General. So obviously, in the War of Afghanistan, Canada's first major war since Korea, the majority of Canadian casualties were caused by improvised explosive devices, followed by landmines, vehicle accidents, and friendly fire. So casualties in these categories, while no less tragic, would not qualify for a VC recommendation. Furthermore, Canada's enemies are now terrorist and interstate groups, and seldom do armies engage en masse in the field. Similarly, the scale of battles and the subsequent casualty rates on the modern battlefield are much smaller than those of the First and Second World Wars, further limiting the possibilities of a VC recommendation. Canada's largest combat operation since Korea was Operation Medusa in September 2006, which lasted approximately 2 weeks. They had about 1,000 casualties and they claimed 12 Canadian war dead. While Operation Medusa was mostly successful at the time, driving out the Taliban, there's a considerable difference between it and the 9,000 Canadian casualties at Hill 70, like Matt talked about, or the 19,000 casualties during the Normandy campaign of 1944. Canada mobilized over 620,000 military personnel in World War I, 1.1 million in World War II, 26,000 in Korea, and 40,000 in Afghanistan, which is obviously significantly less servicemen in the field over time, which has contributed to the lower probabilities of VC actions. So despite all these factors influencing the modern battlefield, there was still plenty of intense fighting and individual acts of gallantry throughout the war in Afghanistan. Indeed, 109 Canadians were honored with immediate gallantry awards, and 20 Canadians won the Star of Military Valor, which is the second highest award in our honor system. So nearing the end of the Afghanistan mission in 2012, and realizing that no VCs would be awarded to Canadians, each of the 20 Star Military Valors were reviewed by a committee of general officers for the purpose of possibly upgrading any one of them to a Victoria Cross. All 20 were ultimately found to be undeserving of the Victoria Cross standard. The director of the Directorate of Honors and Recognition, Lieutenant Colonel Carl Gauthier, concluded, "It's not that we didn't want to award a VC. It's simply that nobody met that very, very high standard for a Victoria Cross action. If one had, I can assure you, it would have been awarded." It's interesting that Canada was the only major Allied formation in Afghanistan not to award its highest award for gallantry. Britain awarded 3 Victoria Crosses in Afghanistan. Australia awarded 4. New Zealand, a small nation, awarded 1. And of course, it's different, but the US issued 20 Medals of Honor for Afghanistan. And I personally find it implausible that not one Canadian action was worthy of a Victoria Cross in our longest conflict. So the photo here with General Rick Hillier and Private Jess La Rochelle was sort of the last attempt to bring a Victoria Cross to an Afghanistan veteran. So this actually was a very recent effort earlier this year. Various advocacy groups and the Royal Canadian Legion basically endorsed La Rochelle for his actions in Afghanistan in 2006, where the Taliban actually fired a rocket-propelled grenade into his outpost, destroyed it, killed 2 of his platoon members. He was badly wounded, continued to fight on, drove off all the Taliban fighters. It was quite an action, and off the cuff, it sounds at least eligible for consideration. So these advocacy groups sort of gathered signatures. They went through their MP. They brought it to the House of Commons to create a potential committee which would review any ultimate decisions on Canadian awards with the eye of potentially upgrading them to Victoria Cross. This wouldn't just be for La Rochelle, but any actions in the past that maybe were overlooked for various reasons. And it's something that's commonly been done in the US and Australia. They do have committees that look at these awards. Very famously, the US in the 1990s in the Clinton administration, they upgraded, I believe, 7 or 8 Medal of Honors, lesser awards to Medal of Honors to African American soldiers who were overlooked for obvious reasons. So the fact that we don't even have this measure in Canada to review actions, it's quite unfortunate. So they brought this to the floor in the House of Commons. I think it was in May of this year, and it needed a unanimous approval, and it didn't get that. And that effectively killed any possibility of an Afghanistan veteran receiving a Victoria Cross. And I think that's a very sad thing that Canada's longest conflict officially ended without a single veteran receiving Canada's highest honor. So where does this leave us now? Obviously, it's one thing to identify the problem and the reasons for it, but we must also discuss possible solutions, and I've identified a few. The first would be, redefining the standard for the modern context. And to be clear, this does not mean cheapening or lowering the standard. Canadian service personnel have always been criminally undermettled, but it is anachronistic to apply 19th and early 20th century standards to an award in the 21st century. Canada is no longer spearheading major Allied offensives and sustaining 4 or 5 figure casualty rates. Director Gauthier himself has warned against comparing awards in conflicts a century apart, noting that VCs were awarded a lot more freely than they are today because the concept of war has evolved. If war has evolved, then so too must the standards of our award system. For an award earned in the presence of the enemy, we must better understand and define what the new face of the enemy looks like into the 21st century. Interstate ideologies, cyber and crypto warfare, foreign influence, and even newer, less understood threats to Canada and its interests must be considered. The second of my 3 points before I conclude is to reevaluate the bureaucracy. I think that's really an issue that plagues the recommendation, ultimate approval of these awards. Is that there's so many committees, in both the military chain of command and through political back channels. Also, the requisite paperwork for such a nomination alone appears to be a major obstacle in the CEF, which has long been criticized, as those who serve know, for lack of urgency on such matters. The committee, reviewing the 20 SMVs, for instance, was reactionary and still resulted in no nominations. And I would say that, evaluating valor is a very subjective category, but what threshold are they using? What definitions are they using? Why are they not looking at other Commonwealth nations and what they were able to describe? Because the citations that I've read for many of these SMVs, they're very similar in their impact to those of the past. So there must be a better way to carry out these nominations through a sustained conflict and not hastily after the fact in sort of panic mode. I think we require a streamlined nomination review and approval process. We've talked about these committees in the US and in other Commonwealth nations like Australia. We should have one too, to sort of review these cases, especially when more information is found. Lastly, before I conclude, my possible solutions for this issue that faces Canada today is re-examining the purpose of the Canadian Victoria Cross. As I said from the beginning, I think the Canadian Victoria Cross is essentially a theoretical award. It's not one that's been issued into practice. The likelihood of an individual winning a Canadian VC now, I think, is arguably impossible, because the precedent of this VC has now been hardened to the point where any individual would now assumedly be compared to every action of every serviceman in Afghanistan. So you have this stacking effect where service personnel, yes, compared to the First World War, the Second World War. Well, we didn't give any to Afghanistan, so why would anyone else in the future be eligible for such an award? It makes it impossibly difficult that we've now established and cemented this precedent. In other words, what will the veterans of Canada's future conflicts look like? How would they even be eligible for such an award? I think we must reevaluate the purpose of having the Canadian Victoria Cross and more clearly define how it can be won in our modern context. Otherwise, what's the point of its very existence? The award will always embody the past and represent those who earned it. But modern personnel must be considered for future awards. Thank you for listening.